Chai Academy. Welcome to the Chai Center. It's good to be back after the weekend. We are middle of the Holocaust series, and we have we discussed Mengele recently. We discussed capos. We discussed reparations, etc. So another fascinating, riveting topic is Adolf Eichmann. So what's interesting is the U.S. after the war. I mean, Adolf Eichmann, he was the architect of the final solution, right? He was the chief administrator of the final solution. What's interesting is the U.S. had him. They had him. They imprisoned him, and he escaped prison. And from there, he went to Argentina. I mean, it's just now it may be a good thing that he escaped and he went to Argentina, and then the rest of the story, because it brought such an awareness to the world about the atrocity. If he would have been just another prisoner, but this really brought things to the surface. So let's begin. The probably the most important trial that ever took place in Israel. The person was not Jewish. The person was not a resident of Israel, and the crimes took place before Israel was even founded. So there's the irony there. And I'm talking about, of course, the Adolf Eichmann, and who was known, by the way, as Ricardo Clement in Argentina. After he escaped, he made his way to Argentina, and there he lived. He lived there for 15 years. 15 years. And the intelligence got a tip, and they got a tip from a fellow by the name of Fritz Bauer. Fritz Bauer lived in Frankfurt, West Germany at the time, and Fritz Bauer knew. He got a tip where Eichmann was. Fritz Bauer knew if he went to the West German police, he felt they were so anti-Semitic they wouldn't have done anything. So therefore, he let Israeli intelligence know. So now, Eichmann was caught, and we'll talk about it. But I don't think, aside from anti-Semites, I don't think anybody disagreed that Israel did not have the right to try Eichmann. I think after what happened, the chief administrator, and he was the chief administrator of the final solution. He's responsible for 6 million Jews, essentially. 2 to 3 million gas chambers, 2 to 3 million shot or labor camps or starvation, etc. It was him. So and by the way, and to add insult to injury, is that at the end of the war, it was apparently he had told people that he's going to go to the grave happy that he killed so many Jews. So a really bad man. Anyway, so he fled to Argentina, and then Israel got a tip. Israel knew with no uncertainty that Argentina would not extradite him. I think Argentina had been proven that they weren't exactly in Israel's court, in the Jewish court, and so Israel had to find a way to get him to Israel without the Argentinians knowing. And the way they did it was that Eichmann, who was a cabinet member at that time, Ben Gurion's cabinet member, a very brilliant man for that matter, brilliant. So Eichmann, he said he's going to come to Argentina, and he's going to have political diplomatic talks, etc. And he flew El Al to Argentina commercially, and he flew back commercially with a regular, even though he was a high-ranking cabinet member representing the Prime Minister of Israel, he flew commercial. When he flew commercial, so he brought a few people with him, obviously, a posse, an entourage, and there were other Israelis that flew separately, and and what they did is they kidnapped Eichmann off the street. So it took all of about 20 seconds. Ricardo Clement, aka Eichmann, was living a simple life in Argentina. He worked in an auto factory, Mercedes-Benz factory. He had a wife and 2 kids. One time he was waiting at the bus stop and he was thrown into a van. And it took quite a while for them to get him to sign a confession, because Israel courts could not try him unless they felt that they couldn't they felt, I'm not sure the legal jargon, but anyway, eventually they managed to get him to sign, and then they drugged him. They put him in a wheelchair, and they brought him to El Al flight going to Israel, and they said that this is a man, is a wealthy invalid who wants to live out his last days in Israel. So and this was in May 1960. So once he was on the plane, and the plane was well on its way to Israel, the head of the Mossad, Issa Haral, announced that Eichmann is now in our hands, which was a tremendous, tremendous victory. That Adolf Eichmann, is now in the hands, and they gave the details, and the trial commenced. This trial was really shed light on what exactly happened. This trial, it was broadcasted to many, many countries of the world, and of course, day in, day out, survivors spoke, and the survivors spoke, and other people spoke, and it was just they really pinpointed what exactly Eichmann did. In fact, it was such an important trial that every day it was broadcast to New York for a half hour. Half hour of the trial about Eichmann's atrocities. Now, when the young Israelis, when they were listening to this trial and they were listening to what happened, it's interesting. They had a reaction that you didn't think they would have, and that was anger, but not at Eichmann. Their anger turned inward. The anger turned against the Jews. How could you be led to slaughter like sheep? How could you allow that? Of course, what they didn't realize is that there was the Jews. They had no weapons. Even in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was like one weapon per 40 people. It was a joke. It was ridiculous. They had no weapons. They were starving, right? And even those that could flee the concentration camps and they could escape. These are the thoughts they had plaguing them. That if I escape, then the Nazis are going to kill 20 Jews because of me. So how do you, and by the way, these are some of the questions that were asked. We spoke about it once, the ethical questions the Jews had. Their actions affected others. And in addition, so they escaped. They didn't have people helping them. The Poles, especially the Poles, if they found a Jewish escapee, what they did was they brought him back. So it was just a terrible situation, and the young Israelis really had to be educated as to the horrific position these Jews were in. Now, if partisans, the Polish partisans, the Lithuanian partisans, and others, if they would have helped the Jews more, it would have been a different story. But they didn't, had nothing. They were left bereft of, they barely had what to eat. You know how many people died in the Warsaw Ghetto? I mean, just incredible amounts. Now, there's a book, a phenomenal book. It's written by Hannah Arendt, and it's called Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil. And she was struck, one of the things she writes in the book is she was so struck how Adolf Eichmann, he looked so simple, so regular, so banal, so boring. But yet this man was responsible, and it struck her. This is just a regular Joe. A regular Joe. Even in his early years, he was just a regular guy. And he can do such horrific things. The Aran, by the way, the Hannah Aran, the author of this book, in the book, she points fingers. She does point fingers at the Judenrat, in Europe, the Jewish organizations, the federations that they had then that cooperated with the Nazis. She was ruthless in her attack on these people. Just ruthless. She said that you're the ones, you cooperated with them, you're responsible for the death, and the book was actually very controversial when it came out, because you had people like Martin Buber who said, stop, you can't place you're detracting the blame from the Nazis to the European Jewish federations. So anyway, so it was after a long time, it was decided, and when it came out as guilty, what to do with him. Now, Israel doesn't put anybody to death. They have that policy. They've always had that policy. But a few years before, so remember, this was 1960, the Knesset had passed a law that a Nazi criminal can be sentenced to death. And in this case, they agreed that this man has to be hung, and he was tried, found guilty, and hung. And then eventually he was cremated, and his ashes were thrown in the Mediterranean Sea, because they did not want Nazis, to use his burial place as a shrine. It's almost the same thing they did with Osama bin Laden. It's interesting that, and I don't know who it was, that Adolf Eichmann's attorney, his argument against the death penalty was, look, if God didn't will 6 million Jews to die, then 6 million Jews wouldn't have died. This is God's will. Yeah, this is which is such a troubling thing to say, but obviously the way we look at it, the correct way is God's will. God's will is God's will. But however, Eichmann chose to be the one to do it. So he was hung. Right before he was hung, he was led to the gallows. He made a comment, something to this effect. He said, "I am an idealist," whatever that means. So he was anyway. So and that was and now during the trial, which is interesting. During the trial, which was he was hung in 1962, and they captured him in 1960. So he lived a couple of years after he was captured. So the trial went on for a long time. It's interesting that during the trial he had support from Arab nations, the Arab nations who hated the Jews. So they made cartoons, and one cartoon that struck me in particular, it was the Al Anwar, Lebanese paper, I believe, and it's a cartoon where it's Ben Gurion looking to Adolf Eichmann, and he's saying, "You deserve the death penalty because you killed 6 million." And Adolf Eichmann answers, "I deserve the death penalty because I didn't kill you all." So what a horrific ad. And other papers also, they said, "We support you. You did the right thing. by doing what, these Arab papers. So he so while once again, most people, except for anti-Semites, most people believed that this is the right thing to have happened. Justice was served. This man was hung, killed, cremated, be done with, and the world got a first-hand account of the atrocities. We got them in Nuremberg, but this is now 15 years later when interest was beginning to wane. And so that's why I say that it's perhaps better that he wasn't part of the Nuremberg trials, but rather he was a separate entity. You may have seen pictures of the trial. By the way, he was kept in a bulletproof box, and it was an extremely emotional trial, where the survivors, the Holocaust survivors, I think there were a couple 100,000 living in Israel. The Holocaust survivors, each one got up and they told their tale and they cried and they shouted and they pointed at him. And once again, he didn't. There was no emotion. There was nothing. He just sat there, and he took it. Was he getting inside? Was he getting glee and joy that he tormented so many Jews? It's possible. I'm not sure. But most people did not support him. The anti-Semites. So I'm sure there were fellow Nazis supported him. The Lebanese, the Al Anwar paper, they supported him. But most people, I think, good, moral, upstanding people, realized that this trial was so vital and it was so important that he be found guilty, and so important that he ultimately be sentenced to death, and then eventually put to death. So that is the tale of Adolf Eichmann, who may his bones rot in hell, and may the only time we mention him is to talk about how he was guilty, found guilty, and hung, just like he did to many, many Jews on the gallows. It's a pity you can't hang him and hang him again. That would have been real justice.